Okay, welcome to the final video for Paper 2, Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. This is looking at key topic 3, which is Norman England. Just kind of break that down a little bit, this is looking at the consolidation of Norman power. So whilst it does look from the start of the Norman conquest from 1066 through to 1088, a year after William's death, it is predominantly looking at the latter half as well of the consolidation after the rebellions and the securing of the throne during the 1060s. So we're going to start straight away with the feudal system, and this is arguably one of the biggest changes and one of the biggest legacies of the Norman conquest on England, as it shapes English society for the next essentially 400 years after the Norman conquest, and it's a feudal system as well. Now, in Anglo-Saxon England, there was a social hierarchy, which looked fairly similar to the feudal system, but the key change is that the feudal system gives William more power than any monarch has really had before, and we know that there are big changes when it comes to increasing of the monarch's power. So whilst the Anglo-Saxons did have the king at the top, they had the earls, they had thanes, that local nobility class, they had the freemen, the ceorls, they had peasants. The Norman system will essentially have a lot of these things, but they will differ to give William more power. So let's talk about William then. He owns all of the land in England. Gone are the days of these really powerful earls like we had in Anglo-Saxon England. He directly owned 60% of the land in England. That was the royal demesne, that French word meaning directly held. 25% was still held by the church, so there was some continuity there from Anglo-Saxon England. But it's how William divvies out that land then to the rest of his followers. Obviously, just represented by the image on the right here, it's all about loyalty and it's all about homage. So this is a ceremony where a tenant-in-chief, so the aristocracy, the nobles, the bishops, the archbishops, they would swear loyalty to William in order to receive land, titles, positions, status as well. There are about 200 tenants-in-chief in number, but they all owe that loyalty to William as well, and their job is essentially to provide William with the knights that he will need in order to put down rebellions or for any sort of military conquests, which he embarks on quite a lot throughout the rest of his reign as well. So they get that land in return for that agreement of military service as well. So he obviously has immense amounts of power in that sense as well, but obviously he also has the power to remove that land as well as give it away as well. So that's through the process of forfeiture. So if you were unable to oblige to your feudal duties, if you were unable to provide the amount of military men that William needed, he had the right to forfeit that land from you, and that was obviously a really powerful tool in ensuring that his tenants-in-chief behaved well there too. He also had the power of the relief payment as well, obviously. So inheriting a earldom was not a given. You had to request that from the king. So if your father died and your father was the earl, you had to travel to William wherever he was. You had to repay him homage, re-swear your loyalty to him, and pay a certain amount. Again, it's just ensuring that any earl could not just simply inherit the earldom, take power away. This means that William can take control. And that's when we get the revolt of the earls in 1075, when William takes the opportunity to reduce the earldom of Hereford and Norfolk as well, which Roger and Ralph were unhappy about. So obviously to talk about the tenants-in-chief as well, so that's the main word that you need to use for them. They are tenants. They do not own that land. They are simply loaning that land, if you will. But the fact they're in chief means that they are some of the most powerful people in the land, and that's like we said, our bishops, our barons is the Norman word for it, or nobles. Lanfranc was a tenant-in-chief. Bishop Odo was a tenant-in-chief. William Fitz Osborne was a tenant-in-chief. All these really, really, really important people as well. They probably held about another 25% of the land in all, and obviously they're not interested in whole. The only reason they want that land is for its wealth, and they would then provide some of that land to their under tenants, so under being below them, to their knights as well. That might be a group of villages, or a small town, for example. And it's the knights, obviously, that are crucial to the whole feudal system. It is a military system. It is designed to ensure loyalty, but also to provide William with a large army at any given point as well. So this is different in the way in which the Anglo-Saxons raised the Fyrd. They here are actually raising a really highly experienced fighting force, and that this idea of knight service develops as a result of this as well. So 40 days of service were required of a knight, and with this, William could raise 4,000 to 5,000 knights at any given time as well, and he would have used this to raise royal armies in times of need, with with some of the rebellions that we talked about in the last video as well. So it's a really significant ability that William has. He's able to raise an army at such speed as well. Obviously, the knights, their main duty is to fight and to be armed and prepped for war. So they would need money. They would need the ability to raise that capital for war horses, for armor, for weaponry as well, for food and supplies. So what they do is they would give their land, again, rent their land out to freemen, who were obviously, they were peasants, but they didn't, they weren't tied to the land as well, so they could go to different places as well. They could grow their own food, sell some as well, make some money. And then the peasants. So again, 70% of the population were still peasants, like in Anglo-Saxon England. It's probably about 1.5 million of the population at the time, so the majority of the population. And they had to give something called labour service. So this, for 2 to 3 days a week, they had to work on their lord's land and provide food for their lord, and then they could provide, grow their own food at that time as well. But they were strictly bound to that land. There was really strict rules in the feudal system about peasants. They had to request to leave the village, their lord's permission. They had to request the lord's permission to marry as well. So whilst the Normans eventually were getting rid of the idea of slavery, peasants were in effect slaves. They were often called serfs, and serfdom was a kind of a legal binding between lord and peasant, which effectively made you a slave as well. So it's a really significant system. It gives William extreme amounts of power, and again, his ability to raise a military service as well. The other massive change at this time then is also the church as well. We mentioned in the previous video about the appointment of Lanfranc in 1070, and he becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070. Stigand is removed. Obviously, Stigand had rebelled against William. He had not submitted initially in 1066. He'd also pushed for Edgarethon to be king, and significantly, he had crowned Harold Godwinson king of England on the 6th of January, 1066. So William is keen to get rid of Stigand. Stigand was also criticised for this idea of pluralism, the fact that he was the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Winchester. This was technically not allowed in the church, which meant someone like Stigand was receiving payments from both of those dioceses, making him extremely wealthy. He obviously served on the Witan as well. William can't have people like that, two people who are too powerful that could potentially rival his own power as well. He trusts Lanfranc, and so therefore wants Lanfranc to represent him in the church, and obviously wants Lanfranc to advise him as well. Lanfranc significantly considered William his ruler over the Pope, though, as well. So whilst Lanfranc was religious, he owed his loyalty to William, and this is what William needs. And we know that Lanfranc later, during the rule of the Earls, acted as a regent because William trusted him quite a lot as well. So he's going to put in a lot of reforms, which on the surface are going to make the Normans look extremely pious and religious. Obviously, William had brought the papal banner at Hastings. He had the backing of the Pope. He made Harold swear on the holy relics. But for me, this is a really clever propaganda method that William uses to show the people of England that the Normans are bringing religious reform. They care about religion in the country and Christianity and a greater connection to God. But really, almost, when you scratch beneath the surface, this is that continued process of Normanization that we spoke about in the last video. This idea of slowly introducing Norman customs, Norman language, Norman buildings, to kind of increase Norman power. And one of those big examples is that of cathedral building as well. And just on the right there, we mentioned Ely in the previous video with the rebellion of Herod the Wake. Ely Cathedral is built during the Norman Conquest, and many other cathedrals as well are built during this time period as well, Durham in particular. And these cathedrals are huge, huge buildings. They were the biggest buildings around at the time as well. So they were the equivalent of a skyscraper today. Hugely impressive, built from stone, beautiful interiors. And people really did think that this was the closest to heaven that they would get. The cathedrals purposely had lots of windows, so they were extremely bright inside as well. It was that idea of the light of heaven coming through as well. So the Normans embark on this. This had been quite popular in Normandy beforehand, but they'd never seen anything of this sort in England before this as well. So this, alongside the huge castle building program, was a real statement of intent from the Normans that they were the overlords and they were there to stay as well. Alongside that, Lanfranc also put lots of money into the monasteries. As we know, they were in decline during the latter Anglo-Saxon period as well. So he increased the number of monasteries, he increased the number of monks, and these become centres of learning. Also, again, it's just increasing that power, isn't it, across the whole country. The Normans are making the church better, and that's what people wanted. The peasantry wanted that. The church, going to church was a relief from the daily grind of working in the fields all the time as well. He also sets up church courts as well in order to kind of deal with any corrupt bishops or monks as well. And this was again an ability to remove any Anglo-Saxon church people who were considered corrupt as well. By the end of William's reign, essentially all of the Anglo-Saxon churchmen had been replaced by Normans as well. So all the key Normans are in those key positions as well. By 1086, the 3 abbeys in England have English abbots, just to give you kind of context there as well. He also enforced these reforms as well on corruption to make sure that priests were meant to be single, be celibate as well. And then he bans the simony, so the selling of church posts, nepotism, selling church positions to a family or friend, and then what we spoke about earlier with pluralism as well. So the reforms are, again, massively significant. They do show the Normans to be extremely pious and religious, but it is all to do with the idea of increasing Norman control and through that process of Normanization. Now, other than the land holding changes and the major changes at the top in government and obviously the church, I think it's worth us having a quick chat about some of the changes to society as well. Obviously, by the 1070s, people in Anglo-Saxon England had begun, or the Anglo-Saxons even had begun to accept Norman rule. So after those final rebellions of the north as well. And this map on the left here does show the extent of William's empire. So you can see the regions of England, obviously, that he conquered. There's Normandy, and then there's the region of Maine below Normandy as well. So he was powerful, really powerful at this time. I think that's worth noting that anyway. One key thing we do see is during the Anglo-Saxon era, there was some trade with northern France, but predominantly England would trade with northern Germany and also Scandinavia with those Viking routes as well. What we see, in particularly after the harrying of the north and the destruction of the city of York and the obliteration of the north of England, is we see less trade with from the North Sea with Scandinavia. Within a couple of hundred years, that trade picks up again, but it takes quite some time. So what we do see, one huge change, is that we do see a greater trading, a mercantile relationship with France, northern France as well. We start to see that come through as well. So a lot of the southern ports start to gain prestige and wealth and prosperity during this time as well. Tin and wool are sold more in France. So that a whole, we'd said earlier in a previous video that wool was obviously one of England's biggest exports, and there's a bigger market for it in France by this time as well. William obviously benefits from this through taxation as well, and he does use taxation quite heavily. He does use the geld tax quite heavily, the tax that was originally designed to fight off the Vikings. He uses that probably more than any Anglo-Saxon monarch, and obviously he's collecting the tax from all the merchants as well. So England's wealth increases, but again, it's the idea that we're seeing less of a relationship with Scandinavia. For people on a local level in the villages, very little would have changed for them, other than the thanes. So on the bottom right there, the thanes as a nobility class were completely wiped out. Not necessarily that they were killed, but they were removed from their positions, and knights obviously replaced them as well through that knight service. Those undertenants replaced the thane class. So that's the only major change they would have seen. They probably would have still spoken their own Anglo-Saxon dialect, which obviously eventually evolves into English. But it's in the kind of upper parts of society, in the aristocracy, that we would have seen Norman French being introduced as well. We have lots of words in our language today that come from French because of the Norman conquest. Things like beef and pork, Renaissance. There are so many. That's probably the big change, and obviously fashion as well. So that typically was the Norman hairstyle with the shaved back there. But generally speaking, towns would have changed more than villages with the language. Obviously, some of the new products coming in from France, fashion. Obviously, buildings would have changed as well. Lots of more stone buildings like the cathedrals, the churches, monasteries, and the castles as well. So just to talk about government, so when we taught you about about Norman England government, we used the kind of mnemonic of the Freds as well, and the Freds really helped break down the big kind of changes. We've already talked about quite a few of them already, but just to talk about F first, because F is quite a significant one, and that is the forest laws. So these laws were technically just hunting laws, and they banned people, so peasants, from entering royal hunting grounds, and hunting was a favoured pastime of the nobility and aristocracy. But it's at the same time it's a way in which William can actually increase his control as well. So the English, the Anglo-Saxons, could physically not step foot in these forests, and they quickly grew all across the country. And the map on the right just shows you, as of circa 1200, so obviously this is way after the Norman conquest, but it kind of shows you how these developed. That's England, and they are all the royal forests as well. The biggest one being down here in the south was the New Forest, which was huge, which was in the old heart of Wessex. So again, it's another way in which William could control. He takes more land. There were extremely harsh punishments for entering the forest. Could have been fines, mutilation, so chopping off of hands or nose or ears, and even execution as well. So they are really significant for increasing his control, and again, it's his status and his power. Regents, we've spoken about it quite a lot in a lot of the videos. Obviously, William spent about 80% of his time in Normandy. Once the threats of the rebellions subsided, he spends even more time in Normandy as well. So he needed people who he could rely on to rule in his stead in England as well. And we know that he appoints his most trusted followers. His wife Matilda was often used to rule Normandy. William Fitz-Osborne, Odo, Lanfranc, and again, they helped to maintain his supremacy. There's a continuity of power as well because of these people being in charge as well. The first E, was the reduction of earldoms. Again, we've already spoken about that before, but William makes earldoms a lot smaller and takes any opportunity to reduce the size of earldoms. Wessex and Mercia cease to exist by the end of William's reign. Northumbria is halved, and over time it becomes even smaller as well, obviously making sure that no earl could rival his power, like someone like Harold Godwinson, who could easily rival Edward the Confessor's power as well. We're going to talk about the Doomsday in more depth on the next slide, and obviously the final one there is the sheriff. This is a direct continuity from Anglo-Saxon England, where we had the Shire Reeve, who obviously they represented the monarch in the shires in Anglo-Saxon England. That's no different. William uses the role. The phrase changes into Norman French and becomes sheriff, and they do the same thing. They would obviously collect taxes, carry out the king's justice, show the power of the king, help with the raising of the knights when it need as well. Obviously, they would also receive the writs from the king, those written commands. And I think the biggest change from the sheriff to the shire reeve is that the sheriff was directly responsible to the king. So that gave the sheriff far more power than they had in Anglo-Saxon England. The shire reeve in Anglo-Saxon England was responsible usually to the earl of that earldom. That has completely changed now. They're directly responsible to the king. And sheriffs in medieval England become the main antagonists in stories, particularly in Robin Hood. It's the Sheriff of Nottingham who is always raising tax and trying to increase his own power because he had that influence from the king as well. So the Doomsday Book then obviously is with the feudal system and castles are some of the most important legacies of the Norman conquest as well. And it's in Christmas 1085, so just a year before William's death, he orders this survey of England. We're not sure exactly why he does this. We know that in 1085 he had gathered all of the tenants-in-chief to him for them to swear loyalty to him again. But also there was rumours of a Danish threat potentially as well. So it seemed that he was keen to raise, a huge army, and so that's one of the reasons why we see that. But what it also does is, after 20 years of Norman control, there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of change with land holding as well, and this was a chance to kind of take stock of who owned what really. So obviously the appropriate tax could be raised as well. It is by far, the largest undertaking of its sort in history as well, and it's not probably until 1801 when the first ever census in the United Kingdom takes place, which identifies who's who, where they live. I don't think something such as the Doomsday had been carried out since then as well. So it's obviously hugely significant in that sense, and it does give William a massive idea about what is in his country. To give you some context, it only takes 6 months. There are 2 versions of it. There's Great and Little Doomsday, and it's nicknamed Doomsday because the commissioners who obviously found this information out were dreaded, because they were trying to find out everything that you own, so you would maybe have to pay more tax. So it got given the nickname the Doomsday, as in like the day of judgment. The doom has come. Ironically, William uses the Anglo-Saxon administrative system. He didn't change that, so it was really, really effective, meaning that it only took 6 months to take place as well. And to give context again, it mentions 13,000 different places, 30,000 different manors, so that's kind of like where knights would live. Dagenham is in the Doomsday Book, and many other villages as well. So with this, obviously, it gives the monarch power. He knows exactly who owns what. He could obviously, if there's any relief payments that have been missed, or he wanted to use the process of forfeiture, he could increase the tax. He could see that if people had more wealth than he'd first envisaged, then he could tax them more as well. So it does give him, that huge power as well. He could also calculate whether or not the tenants-in-chief were giving him the right amount of knights as well. That may have changed as well. But I think I'm often unsure of its impact on William, as it's likely that William was illiterate and he's dead within a year as well, so he would never have read it. But nonetheless, it obviously is a huge, massive undertaking, and it is a symbol of Norman power, and I think that's the key analysis that I would go for when analysing the Doomsday Book. So, kind of getting towards the end, obviously the relationship with the Norman aristocracy is significant with William as well, and it's within his own family that causes the bigger problems later on in his reign. After 1075, there are no threats in England as such, and then we turn to his own son Robert and his half brother Odo as well. So Odo was immensely powerful. He was often described as the second king, really, at times as well, and he serves as regent. He's obviously William's half brother. William had made him the Bishop of Bayeux, which was a hugely significant post in Normandy, essentially like the equivalent of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but in Normandy as well. But even though he's a man of God, he was extremely corrupt. He did not live a celibate life. He was very, very interested in women, and he was often unjust and greedy as well. And there's reports that some of his men were found guilty of rape and plunder, and he protected them. There's stories of him trying to illegally seize land as well, and there's lots of complaints from the Anglo-Saxons to William by him as well. But regardless of that, Odo still maintains a lot of power during that entire time. He provides 100 ships for the invasion of England. So as soon as you provide that military aid for William before Hastings, you are, as we know, rewarded. And in 1067, he becomes one of the largest landowners in England after William, when he's made the Earl of Kent. So massively important as well. He leads one of the royal armies to put down the revolt of the Earls, and the late 1060s, early 1070s are probably the pinnacle of Odo's career as well. But when we start to see issues of corruption, even though in 1076 William makes him hand the land back, so even though William knows he's guilty, he keeps William's trust. But it's in 1082 when Odo is planning a military expedition to Italy, in the south of Italy where the Normans had conquered Sicily. He wants to take knights from his own earldom. William refuses, and in the end, Odo attempts to go anyway. He disobeys William, which is the final straw, and William imprisons him. It's not until just before William's death, when William repents for a lot of his sins, that he asks and requests for Odo to be released as well. But that's not the end of Odo, because as we know, there is another rebellion against William, but this is from his own son. And his eldest son, Robert, or Curthose, as William nicknamed him, or so translated to short legs, dumpy legs, in 1078, or through 1077 to 1080, he is in rebellion against his father William as well. Why? Well, he is the eldest son, and he believed that he should have been announced to be the Duke of Normandy. This is the time when William is King of England and Duke of Normandy, but as we know, William did not trust his son. He much preferred the second son, William Rufus, and we know that Robert is humiliated in front of the Norman nobles, with William saying that he would not make him Duke of Normandy as well. And he never chose to make Robert regent as well, because he also did not trust him as well. It seems to all come to a head when William Rufus and their younger brother Henry, who ironically would also become King of England, pour either water or possibly urine over Robert's head. William doesn't punish his brother sufficiently enough in Robert's eyes, and he and many other younger Norman nobles lead a rebellion. The King of France is happy to give them a castle at Gerberoy. William lays siege to it. There's a battle. William is knocked off his horse by Robert, and it seems a symbolic defeat for the first time. We see this generational shift for the very first time as well. That led to the Scots invading. So the Scottish heard news of a rift. They see that William and Robert are in Normandy fighting, and they invade as well. Matilda, William's wife, is supporting their son, unsurprisingly as well, but eventually she convinces William to make amends with Robert as well. So they finally agree to put an end to the rebellion. William agrees that Robert will become the Duke of Normandy on his death, but he does not state he'll be the King of England. That's quite ambiguous. They both ride north. They both hammer the Scots, and they build a castle. And just to show on the right there, a brand new one called Newcastle in 1080. Now, William dies in 1087. He dies whilst fighting in France. He falls off his horse. He's in his 60s by this point. He's overweight, and the wound leads to his death as well. He unceremoniously dies. His body explodes, and he's hurriedly buried. And his servants at the graveside rob his tomb. During the French Revolution, his tomb is completely destroyed and smashed. So what we see on the left there is a new modern version of William's tombstone. But significantly, on his deathbed is the time where he decides to beg for forgiveness from God, and he is obviously very ambiguous about the succession. So we get the second succession crisis. So after 1066, the death of William in 1087, going into 1088, we see the second succession crisis. He thinks that God shall decide. Now, Robert, as eldest, believes that he should be King of England and Duke of Normandy, because that was Norman custom. But as we know, William the Conqueror preferred his younger and second son, William Rufus, pictured on the right there. William Rufus was meant to be a mirror of his father, not necessarily in looks, but just in kind of decision making and the aura that he had as well. And I think most of the Norman tenants in chief also see this as well, and they want William Rufus to be king. The problem is you can't have someone as Duke of Normandy and then someone separate as King of England. Many of these earls and tenants in chief had lands in Normandy and England. Who do you pay homage to? Who's in charge? So this becomes problematic. So they only need one person in charge, and they obviously want William Rufus, and they don't want Robert. But this is where we see Bishop Odo return as well on being released from prison on William's deathbed, and he sees in Robert a chance to get back into power. Robert is easily manipulated. He's not strong like William Rufus. He's not strong-willed like his father. Odo sees an opportunity, so he plans a rebellion in which Robert will invade England and Odo will take power. Odo quickly attempts to take Rochester, but William Rufus is extremely quick and decisive, just like his father, and he immediately sieges Rochester and defeats Odo there as well. Odo will eventually leave England and go on crusade and die in 1097 as well. So by this stage, Robert hasn't even crossed the channel, so essentially the rebellion is over before it's even begun as well. So a lack of coordination between Robert and Odo means they can't join forces, just like in the Revolt of the Earls. And obviously there was a lack of trust of Robert and Odo and their ability to rule as well. So that kind of is a key reason for William Rufus as well. So that is the end of the key topic 3. Hopefully you found the video helpful, and tune in next time for paper 3, Germany.